The mocking of humanity. The Galactic Dominion had ruled space for over 1,000 years. Their warships were massive, their fleets unbeatable. No species had ever dared to challenge them, until now. A small human fleet had entered Dominion space. Their ships were nothing compared to the grand war machines of the Dominion. The aliens laughed. Inside the command center of the Dominion flagship Dreadfang, Grand Admiral Tylox watched the human fleet on the holographic screen. His crew of reptilian officers chuckled, their sharp teeth gleaming under the dim blue lights. "They actually think they can fight us," one of the officers sneered. "Pathetic," another muttered. Tylox leaned back in his throne-like chair. His species, the Zorcan, were the strongest warriors in the Dominion. They had crushed countless civilizations. To them, humanity was just another weak race. He turned to his communication officer. "Open a channel to the humans." A moment later, the screen flickered, and a human appeared. It was Captain Reynolds, the commander of the human fleet. He had short brown hair, a scar over his left eyebrow, and eyes that showed no fear. Tylox smirked. "Captain Reynolds, you have entered Dominion space. This is a violation of galactic law. You will surrender immediately, or you will be destroyed." Reynolds didn't flinch. He simply stared at Tylox. For a moment, the Dominion officers expected him to beg for mercy, like most weaker races did. But the human remained silent. Tylox raised an eyebrow. "No words, no surrender. Very well." The Dominion officers laughed. "Humans must be too afraid to speak," one of them joked. "Or maybe they still think they can win," another said, shaking his head. Tylox turned back to Reynolds. "This is your last chance, Captain. Kneel before the Dominion, and we may allow some of your people to live." Still, Reynolds said nothing. Instead, he reached forward and cut the transmission. The laughter in the Dominion command center stopped. Tylox's smirk vanished. No one had ever dared to end a conversation with him like that. It was a direct insult. His claws curled into fists. "Fire a warning shot," he growled. The Dreadfang's massive cannons powered up. A bright ball of plasma energy formed at the tip of the ship's main weapon. A second later, it launched through space, heading straight for the human fleet. The plasma bolt burned through the darkness, glowing like a second sun. It was a warning, not meant to hit, just a reminder of the Dominion's power. The officers expected the humans to panic, to send a desperate plea for mercy. But they didn't. Instead, the human fleet kept moving forward. Tylox's eyes narrowed. Why weren't they stopping? "Perhaps their sensors are broken," an officer suggested. "Or maybe they didn't see the shot," another added, laughing nervously. Tylox wasn't amused. There was something wrong about this situation. He had studied humans before. They were weaker than the Dominion, but they were unpredictable. They didn't fight like other species. "Send another transmission," Tylox ordered. "I want to see their faces when I demand their surrender again." The screen flickered back to life, showing Captain Reynolds once more. "I gave you a warning," Tylox said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is your final chance, human. Surrender or be annihilated." This time, Reynolds spoke. "We're not here to talk," he said. His voice was calm, steady. Tylox frowned. Then Reynolds said something else, something that made the entire Dominion command center go silent. "Fire at will." A second later, the human battleship fired. A bright beam of energy erupted from the massive human warship at the front of the fleet. It cut through the void like lightning, heading straight for one of the Dominion's smaller cruisers. The alien officers barely had time to react. Boom! The Dominion cruiser exploded. Tylox shot up from his chair, his eyes wide in shock. That wasn't possible. No enemy had ever taken out a Dominion warship in one shot. His officers stared at the screen, frozen. One of them whispered, "How?" Tylox's mind raced. He had underestimated these humans. Their ships weren't weak. They weren't primitive. They were deadly, and they had just declared war. The last warning. The command center of the Dreadfang was dead silent. Smoke curled from shattered consoles where sparks had erupted, and the screen still flickered with the fiery remains of the Dominion cruiser that had just been obliterated. Admiral Psylocke's claws dug into the armrests of his throne. His officers, once full of arrogant laughter, were now frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. "A single shot," one of them whispered. "That's impossible." Another gasped. Psylocke snapped his head toward his weapons officer. "Damage report on the human weapon." "What did they fire?" "Plasma." "Railgun?" "Some new tech." The officer frantically typed on his console. His scales had turned a pale shade of green, a color of fear among his kind. "Unknown, Admiral. Our sensors didn't even register an energy signature before impact." Psylocke's cold blood ran colder. No energy signature. That meant the weapon had bypassed their detection grid. Dominion ships were designed to counter any known form of warfare. But this was something else. He bared his sharp teeth. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. The humans had been a joke, a primitive species. Yet in a single moment, they had shattered that illusion. Psylocke slammed a fist onto the command panel. The officers flinched. "Fire back," he growled. The counterattack. Across the Dominion fleet, warships spun into formation. Cannons powered up, glowing red with the energy of plasma reactors. In seconds, the void between the fleets lit up with destruction. Thousands of Dominion rounds streaked toward the human fleet. Torpedoes, plasma blasts, high-energy disruptors. Every weapon in their arsenal was unleashed. It should have been overwhelming. No species had ever survived a full-force Dominion barrage. Yet something happened that no one in the Dominion had ever seen before. The human fleet moved. Not like the slow, clunky movements of most warships. No, they danced. The HSS Retribution, the largest human battleship, rotated at an impossible speed for its size, dodging the first wave of plasma fire. Smaller human ships weaved through torpedo explosions with unnatural precision. "How are they moving like that?" a Dominion officer shouted. Psylocke's eyes narrowed. Human ships were smaller than Dominion warships, but they were faster, far faster than their intelligence reports had predicted. Then, the worst happened. The human ships fired back. From the Retribution, a second blue streak of energy tore through space. It sliced through another Dominion cruiser like paper, its shields doing nothing to stop the blast. Another ship erupted into flames. Then another. And another. Within 20 seconds, 4 Dominion warships had been completely annihilated. The command center was in chaos. Officers screamed. Alarms blared. Emergency lights flashed red. "Admiral, our fleet is falling apart. Their weapons are bypassing our shields." "What? What is happening?" Psylocke's jaw tightened. His officers were panicking. But he saw it clearly now. The humans, they hadn't just come to fight. They had come to win. The human message. A beep echoed through the command center. The screen flickered. A human transmission was coming through. Psylocke's claws hovered over the control panel. For a brief moment, he considered refusing the call. Showing weakness was unacceptable in Dominion culture, but he needed to know what the humans were thinking. He pressed ACCEP. The screen lit up with the face of Captain Reynolds. Unlike before, when he had sat in his chair calmly, Reynolds was now standing, his hands clasped behind his back. Smoke and flashing lights filled the background of his own command center, but his eyes were as cold as steel. "Grand Admiral Psylocke," Reynolds said, his voice eerily calm. Psylocke straightened. The human didn't sound like a warrior delivering an enemy's last rites. No, he sounded like a teacher addressing a misbehaving student. "You wanted to see the strength of humanity," Reynolds continued. "Now you have." Psylocke's lips curled into a snarl. "You think this battle is over, human. You may have struck first, but the Dominion does not lose wars." Reynolds didn't flinch. If anything, his expression became colder. "We didn't strike first," he said. "You did. You fired the warning shot. You made your threats. You assumed we would kneel." Silox's claws twitched. "And now," Reynolds continued, "you realize your mistake." Silox opened his mouth to respond, but then Reynolds lifted a hand. Behind him, Dominion officers noticed something. A countdown timer had appeared on the human screens, a targeting sequence. "Let me be clear," Reynolds said. "We gave you a chance. Now we give you a choice." The screen split. On one side was Reynolds. On the other was the Dominion flagship, Dreadfang. It was locked in the human fleet's crosshairs. "Surrender," Reynolds said, "or we fire again." Silence. Silox's claws curled into fists. For the first time in Dominion history, the greatest fleet in the galaxy was at the mercy of a species they had mocked. And for the first time in his life, Grand Admiral Silox felt fear. First strike, a shock to the galaxy. The silence in the Dreadfang's command center was deafening. Admiral Silox sat frozen in his throne, his reptilian eyes locked onto the screen. The human fleet had them in their crosshairs. His mind raced. This wasn't how wars were fought. Wars followed patterns. A species challenged the Dominion crushed them, and the galaxy moved on. But this was something else. "Admiral," one of his officers whispered, voice trembling. What do we do?" Silox inhaled slowly, his scaled fingers tightening into a fist. "The great Dominion does not surrender." His next words were a gamble. But if he showed weakness now, his career and his life would be over. "Open fire," he snarled. "All ships, everything we have." Now, the firestorm. Across the Dominion fleet, the order spread like wildfire. Cannons roared to life. Torpedo bays lit up, and an avalanche of destruction surged toward the human warships. 100 ships fired at once. The void itself trembled with the sheer power of the Dominion's onslaught. Plasma bolts the size of city blocks ripped through space. Torpedoes locked onto human vessels, and energy beams scorched the darkness. It was a wall of death, the kind that had ended empires. The human fleet should have vanished in flames. But they didn't. Instead, they moved like phantoms. The HSS Retribution tilted at an impossible angle, its thrusters adjusting in ways no Dominion warship could match. Smaller human vessels twisted through the chaos, evading Dominion fire with mechanical precision. They weren't just dodging. They were predicting every attack. "Impossible," an officer gasped, watching the enemy movements on the battle map. "How are they doing this?" Silox didn't answer. His claws dug into his seat. Then the human counterattack began. The turning point. "Fire," Captain Reynolds ordered, his tone emotionless. The Retribution launched a single, blinding blue streak of energy. The shot ripped through a Dominion battlecruiser like paper, slicing it in half before its shields even had time to react. An instant later, 3 more human ships fired. Dominion warships erupted in flames. The fleet that had ruled the galaxy for 1,000 years was being torn apart in seconds. The command center descended into chaos. Officers screamed, reports flooded in. Nothing made sense. The humans' weapons were bypassing shields, their ships were faster, and their targeting was flawless. "We're being outmaneuvered. Our weapons are ineffective. Admiral, we." Then, the worst message of all came through. "Sir, the fleet is breaking apart. Some ships are retreating." Silox's eyes snapped toward the battle map. He saw it with his own eyes. Some Dominion captains, veterans of 100 battles, were fleeing. A cold, horrible realization settled in his mind. They had never fought an enemy like this before. They had never fought humans before. A message of fear. The screen flickered. The human transmission was back. Captain Reynolds stood in his dimly lit command room, arms crossed behind his back. His voice was calm, controlled. unshaken by the destruction around him. "Grand Admiral Psylocke," he said, "I warned you." Psylocke bared his teeth. "You think this war is over, human?" Reynolds tilted his head slightly. "No," he said, "but for the first time, you know what war really is." Psylocke felt something deep in his chest. A cold, unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't rage. It wasn't pride. It was fear. "This battle is already lost," Reynolds continued. "You have two options. Continue fighting and lose everything, or retreat and tell your Dominion leaders the truth." Psylocke's claws trembled. He was trapped. The laughter was gone. The arrogance had turned to horror. For the first time in Dominion history, the great galactic fleet had met its match. And it was human. The battle escalates. The battlefield was no longer a war zone. It was a massacre. The once mighty Dominion fleet, the same force that had crushed entire civilizations, was now in shambles. Fire and wreckage floated in the void, the broken remains of warships that had once been called invincible. But there was no invincibility here. No dominance. No victory. There was only humanity's wrath. Desperation in the Dominion fleet. Admiral Psylocke could feel his heartbeat in his throat. His officers screamed around him, desperately shouting reports, but their voices were distant noise. His sharp claws gripped the armrests of his chair, his mind frozen on a single, horrifying truth. They were losing. Not just losing. Being destroyed. "Admiral," one of his officers shrieked, "we can't hold the line. The humans are cutting through our defenses like they aren't even there. Our ships can't escape. Their fleet is hurting us." Another panicked. "We need orders. What do we do?" Psylocke opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he say? He had mocked these humans. He had laughed at them. Now they were ripping his fleet apart like children tearing paper. A violent explosion rocked the Dreadfang, throwing several officers to the floor. Emergency sirens blared. The ship shook like it had been struck by a god's hammer. "Direct hit," the damage officer shouted. "Our starboard side is compromised. Shields at 32%. Hull breach detected. Decks 14 through 18. Gone." Psylocke's claws trembled. He had never felt helpless in his life. But now he understood. This is what prey felt like. The human counterattack. The HSS Retribution led the charge, its hull gleaming under the glow of burning Dominion warships. Its weapons roared again. Another Dominion dreadnought, the Fury of Zorkin, erupted into flames, breaking apart as explosions tore through its decks. The human fleet moved like hunters, striking and vanishing before the Dominion could retaliate. They weren't just fighting. They were dismantling the enemy piece by piece. Their tactics were perfect, their precision deadly. No wasted shots, no mercy, only annihilation. The Dominion captains were used to brute force battles, overwhelming their enemies with numbers and firepower. But the humans? They fought like predators. They moved with ruthless efficiency, their ships dodging attacks before they even came, as if they could predict the Dominion's every move. This wasn't a battle. It was a lesson. Psylocke's last gamble. Admiral Psylocke's mind raced. He had one last chance. The Dominion fleet was crumbling, but their final weapon had yet to fire. The Leviathan, a planet killer-class superweapon, a behemoth warship lurking at the back of the fleet. It had enough firepower to turn a world to ash. Its main cannon had been charging the entire battle, preparing for a final, devastating shot. If he could destroy the Retribution, the humans would be crippled. "Order the Leviathan to fire the Doomsday Cannon," Psylocke snarled, his voice finally firm again. "Target the Retribution." The weapons officer hesitated. "Admiral, if we fire, we'll—" "Do it," Psylocke roared. The order was sent. The Doomsday shot. The Leviathan rumbled. Its core pulsed with energy, glowing brighter than a sun. The Doomsday cannon reached full charge. It aimed. It fired. A beam of pure destruction tore through space, a blinding white light cutting through the void like the blade of a god. The Dominion officers watched, their hearts pounding, as the blast raced toward the retribution. There was no way to dodge it, no way to survive it. Victory was still possible. Or so they thought. The unthinkable. Just before impact, the retribution moved. Not by thrusters, not by evasive maneuvers. It vanished. For a single, impossible second, it was just gone, like it had never existed. The Dominion officers gasped. Where? A moment later, the retribution reappeared behind the Leviathan. Xylox's mind snapped. That's not possible, he stammered. They poor. No species had mastered battlefield teleportation. No species. And yet, the humans had just done the impossible. How? One of his officers choked out. How are they doing this? Xylox had no answer. Because humanity had just rewritten the laws of war. And before the Leviathan could react, before it could charge another shot, the retribution fired. The Leviathan didn't explode. It detonated. A chain reaction ripped through its core, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. A sun was born in the middle of space. Xylox barely had time to register what had happened before the shockwaves slammed into the Dreadfang, sending it spiraling through space. The fall of the Dominion fleet. The surviving Dominion ships ran. There was no other choice. Their most powerful weapon was gone. Their fleet was in ruins. And the humans? They hadn't even lost a single capital ship. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a statement, a declaration to the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated. And as the Dominion forces fled, leaving behind the burning wreckage of their pride, one truth echoed through the stars. They had laughed at humanity. Now, they would never laugh again. Desperation of the Dominion. The once mighty Dominion armada was shattered. The battlefield was a graveyard of burning warships, their broken hulls drifting in the cold void. The terrifying Leviathan, the Dominion's ultimate weapon, was nothing more than a dying star, its remains scattering across space. And yet, the humans, they stood untouched. The panic begins. Inside the Dominion flagship Dreadfang, Admiral Xylox was breaking apart. He had seen defeat before. He had seen enemies beg for their lives. But he had never seen an enemy fight like this. He had never seen an enemy defy everything he understood about warfare. Admiral, a terrified officer shouted, most of our fleet is in full retreat. No. Xylox snarled, his sharp teeth flashing. His claws dug into his chair, his body trembling with rage. We do not retreat. We are the Dominion. The officer hesitated. Sir, his voice cracked, if we stay, we all die. For the first time, Xylox realized something horrifying. His own crew no longer believed in victory. Fear had infected them. The Dominion, the strongest force in the galaxy, was now afraid of humanity. And Xylox knew, if he lost here, the entire Dominion would collapse. Asterisk weapons. He barked, I don't care what we have left. Fire every thing. The last stand. The few remaining Dominion warships turned to fight. They had no strategy, no formation, only desperation. They fired wildly, emptying their entire arsenal in a final, frenzied attempt to turn the tide. Plasma bolts rained toward the human fleet. Missiles screamed through space. Explosions flashed across the battlefield. For a moment, it seemed as if the Dominion might land a hit. But then, the humans moved again. They weren't just dodging. They were playing. The HSS Retribution rotated at an impossible angle, weaving between Dominion fire with inhuman precision. Its escort ships danced through the chaos, avoiding every shot as if they knew where the Dominion would fire before they even fired it. The realization hit Xylox like a hammer to the skull. They're predicting our attacks. It was too perfect. The humans weren't reacting to Dominion fire. They were anticipating it. How? How? But before Xylox could even process it, the humans fired back. 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 shots. Every single Dominion ship that remained exploded in seconds. The last warship, a once proud dreadnought, vanished in a final blinding blast. It was over. The Dominion's last stand had lasted less than 2 minutes. A message to the Dominion. The battlefield went silent. The only thing left was the HSS Retribution, floating among the wreckage of what was once the most feared fleet in the galaxy. Then, a transmission. Xylox's blood ran cold. He didn't need to see the screen to know who it was. Captain Reynolds. His face appeared, calm as ever. There was no arrogance in his expression, only certainty. "Admiral Xylox," Reynolds said, "the battle is over." Xylox's claws trembled. You think this changes anything?" He spat, though his voice had lost its usual strength. "You think the Dominion will bow to you? We have more fleets, more soldiers, more weapons. You cannot win against us." Reynolds' expression didn't change. "That's the problem with the Dominion," he said. "You think war is about numbers, about size, about who has the biggest fleet." His blue eyes darkened. "But war is about strategy. It's about intelligence. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away." Xylox bared his teeth. "What are you saying, human?" Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "I'm saying this. Take your broken fleet. Crawl back to your Dominion. Tell your leaders what happened here today." His voice dropped lower. "Tell them that humanity is not a species to be conquered." Xylox felt his stomach twist. He realized something far worse than defeat. The humans, they weren't fighting for survival. They were sending a message, and the entire galaxy was going to hear it. Xylox's scales grew cold. He had never in his life felt this much fear. "This isn't over," he whispered. "The Dominion will strike back." Reynolds gave a small nod. "Maybe." He reached forward. The transmission cut out. And with that, the human fleet turned and left. They didn't stay to gloat. They didn't stay to finish the job, because they had already won. The birth of a new power. When news of the battle reached the Dominion homeworld, the effect was catastrophic. Admiral Xylox, the once legendary warrior, had returned in disgrace. The mighty Dominion fleet, gone. The warriors who once ruled the stars, defeated by a species they had laughed at. In the halls of power, Dominion leaders whispered in fear. Because if humanity could do this to their greatest fleet, what else were they capable of? The galaxy had changed, and for the first time in history, the Dominion was afraid. The final blow. The war should have ended that day. The greatest Dominion fleet had been annihilated. Their most powerful weapon, the Leviathan, had been reduced to ashes. Their Grand Admiral, Xylox, had been humiliated in front of the entire galaxy. But the Dominion, they weren't just an empire. They were an obsession with control, an obsession with power, and now, an obsession with revenge. The last command of a broken admiral. Xylox sat in his personal war chamber alone. His clawed hands trembled, not from rage, but from something far worse. Fear. He had returned to Dominion space, expecting to be executed for his failure. Instead, he was given one last chance. A fleet, his last fleet, waited in orbit. They weren't the strongest warships. They weren't the best fighters. But they carried something far deadlier than weapons. They carried desperation. This wasn't a fleet built to win. This was a fleet built to die trying. His orders were clear. Find the humans. Strike first. Burn everything. If they couldn't win a war, they would make sure the humans knew pain. Xylox swallowed hard. He had always believed in the Dominion's superiority. But now he wondered if they had just signed their own extinction. The trap is set. On the edges of Dominion space, A human supply convoy drifted through the void. It was unarmed, unprotected. It carried thousands of colonists, engineers, and scientists. Civilians. An easy target. Xylox's fleet emerged from warp, their warships surrounding the convoy in seconds. His officers, eager for revenge, grinned with anticipation. At last, one of them sneered, "Let them suffer." Xylox hesitated. Something felt off. The human ships weren't running. They weren't sending distress signals. They just floated there. His instincts screamed at him. This was wrong. "Sir," an officer asked, "do we fire?" Xylox hesitated. Then, against his better judgment, he gave the order. "Destroy them. The hunters become the hunted." Just as the Dominion ships locked onto their targets, the entire battlefield changed. The space around them warped. In an instant, dozens of human warships appeared from nowhere, materializing from hidden jump points. Not just any warships. The HSS Retribution led the charge. It had all been a trap. Xylox barely had time to process it before the first shots were fired. A war over in seconds. The Dominion fleet never had a chance. Human battleships unleashed hell before the Dominion forces could even react. One by one, Dominion warships vanished in flames, shattered by pinpoint-accurate railgun fire and pulse cannons. Some tried to fight back. Some tried to flee. None survived. Within 45 seconds, the Dominion's last hope for revenge had been completely erased from existence. Xylox sat in his chair, his eyes wide, his mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. This wasn't war. This was extermination. Then the screen flickered. Captain Reynolds appeared. His face was just as calm as before, just as certain. But now, there was something else in his expression. Finality. "This is your last mistake, Xylox," Reynolds said, voice cold. Xylox opened his mouth to respond, but the screen cut to black. A moment later, the Retribution fired its main cannon. The Dreadfang, once the pride of the Dominion fleet, was obliterated in an instant. Xylox never even had time to scream. The end of the Dominion. When the news reached the Dominion homeworld, it was over. The Dominion Senate fell into chaos. Some wanted to fight to the last soldier. Others begged for peace. But the people, they had seen the truth. Their greatest military minds had been shattered. Their invincible fleet had been wiped from existence. The Dominion had spent centuries conquering and laughing at the weak. But now, the entire galaxy was laughing at them. Within days, planets declared independence. Civil wars erupted. The Dominion, once the most feared empire in the galaxy, tore itself apart from within. And humanity. They didn't even need to fire another shot. The Dominion was dead. A new galactic order. Years later, in the halls of the United Human Federation, a single document was archived. The Battle of Dominion's End. There was no ceremony, no celebration. Because for humanity, this had never been about glory. It had been a warning to anyone, anywhere in the galaxy, who ever thought to challenge them. Because now, the galaxy knew the truth. Humanity didn't just survive. They won, and they would never, ever be underestimated again. The new galactic power. The Dominion was gone. Not with a final war, not with endless battles. It had collapsed under its own arrogance, under the weight of a single, undeniable truth. They had underestimated humanity. For centuries, the Dominion had ruled with fear, but in the end, it was they who had learned the true meaning of it. Now, the galaxy was silent. A silence not of peace, but of uncertainty. Because for the first time in history, humanity stood at the top. The galaxy reacts. Across the stars, empires, federations, and independent worlds all received the same news. The Dominion had fallen. Some celebrated. Their oppressors were gone. No more forced labor, no more invasions, no more worlds burning under Dominion rule. Others watched in terror. Because if the Dominion, the greatest military force in history, had been crushed so easily. What could stop humanity? In the war chambers of the Valorian Empire, one of the most powerful factions remaining, the High Council gathered. The room was filled with uneasy whispers, their golden robes rustling as they debated their next move. "They will come for us next," one of the counselors muttered. "No," another disagreed. "They do not seek war. They ended the Dominion because they were forced to, not because they wanted power. And yet they now hold power," a third voice added. "That makes them dangerous." The room fell silent. Because deep down, they all knew the truth. Humanity did not seek power. But now, the entire galaxy would have to ask themselves, what happens if someone dares to challenge them again? The last message. On Earth, within the towering headquarters of the United Human Federation, Captain Reynolds stood before the Grand Council. Holoscreens flickered around him, displaying live feeds of Dominion worlds. Some were in chaos, others eerily quiet. The Chancellor, a wise woman with silver hair, watched Reynolds carefully. "It is done," she said at last. Reynolds nodded. "Yes, the Dominion is no longer a threat." The Chancellor glanced at the other council members. Some looked relieved, others concerned. "And now the galaxy watches us," she continued. Some in fear, some in admiration, some in suspicion. Reynolds exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" one of the council members asked. The Chancellor stood. "Now," she said, "we decide what kind of power we will be. The shadow of humanity." Though the war had ended, its consequences had just begun. The Dominion's fall left a power vacuum. Without their iron rule, old enemies resurfaced. Rival factions fought for control over abandoned territories. Pirates, warlords, and mercenaries descended like vultures. Some planets, once enslaved by the Dominion, pleaded for humanity's protection. Others warned that human dominance could be even worse. For the first time, humanity stood at a crossroads. Would they become protectors or conquerors? Would they lead the galaxy into an era of peace or into a new war of empires? The answer would shape the future. And the galaxy held its breath, waiting. The final warning. On the farthest edges of explored space, a small Dominion outpost remained intact. Inside, a lone transmission was being sent to an unknown receiver. A single surviving Dominion officer, hidden in the shadows, whispered into the communicator. "The humans, they are beyond anything we imagined." Static crackled. "We were wrong. We thought them weak. We thought them predictable." A pause. Then a slow, careful breath. "They are neither." The transmission ended, and deep in the uncharted darkness of the galaxy, something listened. Something ancient. Something far worse than the Dominion.